morning and welcome to another session, which the last session in our West Africa in the 19th century class, where we'll be discussing the European scramble, the partitioning and colonization of West Africa in the 19th century. In this section, we will examine the motive behind European scramble and partition and imperial influence in West Africa during the 19th century. We will also identify the factors that aided Europeans' takeover of indigenous lands, people, and patrimony in West Africa during the 19th century. The scramble for West Africa by the Europeans' power during the 19th century was the vilest jostling for loot that ever disfigured the history of human conscience. As is been told, explanation for the resurgence of imperialism and colonization in West Africa have been hotly debated among various historians, both Africanist scholars and even Eurocentric scholars. Some have emphasized the role played by Western economic interests in seeking new sources of raw materials that were in short supply in Europe, while others also demonstrated other factors, as we shall see, as well as overseas market for industrial production and investment. If you have read the works of John Hobson, who noted that imperialism occurred in Europe as a result of the surplus goods produced as a result of the Industrial Revolution and the underconsumption of those goods by the middle class in Europe. And this was one of the reasons also given for the European scramble and partition. Others have also focused on the Christian missionaries who needed military interventions from their home government when indigenous people resisted their efforts in propagating the Christian religion. Some Eurocentric intellectuals even have seen the desire for strategic advantage as the principal motivating factor for the European scramble and even eventual colonization of West Africa in the 19th century. But there was, in addition, national pride and the quest for prestige among the leading European powers. Since the acquisition of colonies in Africa was seen as index of power among the powerful European countries, the number of colonies or areas controlled by this European trading influence during the 19th century was seen as a source of prestige among them. So it became imperative for several European powers to compete for territories in West Africa. The more territories controlled by the European powers in the 19th century was seen as an index of pride in the league of powerful European nations. This explains the reason why there was a rekindled interest among the leading European powers in the 19th century to compete. And this was spearheaded by Portugal, by Belgium, and by Germany in the 19th century. So colonialism was therefore rationalized by Eurocentric scholars as an inevitable or unavoidable obligation of the European powers to introduce development. It was said that since Africa is a place of darkness, with barbarous tribes living in pictures and irrelevant corners of the globe, that it was imperative for the Europeans to come and introduce the fruit of modernity to Africa. So civilization was seen as one of the responsibility of the Europeans to the African countries, especially the people of West Africa whom they are denigrated. They also justified the need for the imperialism and partitioning as a result of the need to end human trafficking, cannibalism and warfare in West Africa during the 19th century. The British specifically saw the conquest of West Africa as one of the means to provide the uncivilized and backward people of West Africa with the fruits of its superior culture, especially the spiritual inspiration of Christianity and political benefits of enlightened governance. So these were some of the factors that actually justify the European jostling for territories in West Africa in 19th century. Also, European missionaries and idealistic civil servants believed that it was their responsibility to rescue the indigenous populations of West Africa from superstitious belief and barbaric customs, such as the killing of twins in some parts of West Africa, some places whereby it was alleged that human trafficking and human eating was prevalent. Several factors thus converge to bring about this scramble for land as sphere of influence in Africa among the European countries. So all of these factors, the chief one, of course, was the hegemony which the leading European powers exercised over many communities in different parts of West Africa after the abolition of the slave trade. The abolition of the slave trade also heightened the need by the European powers to want to shift their interest, to other exploitative, endeavors in West Africa. Since the slave trade was no longer available, there was need for the European powers to sustain, their accumulation of wealth and resources in West Africa. So the desire for colonial territories in West Africa was the major cause, of the undue rivalry and competition displayed by major European countries in the 19th century. And this was what led the Europeans to a round table in 1884 to 1885, which is popularly known as the Berlin Conference 1884 to 1885. So we shall take a few minutes to look at the Berlin Conference, the factors that aided, the actors also that spearheaded or pioneered this conference in 1884 and 1885. So it was in 1876 that King Leopold II of Belgium called for a conference at Brussels after a number of agitations and contestation and protests among various European powers who had been supposedly sidelined in the accumulation of territories in West Africa by Britain and France. So it was an official conference of international geographers to appraise the prospect of opening up the interior of West Africa for trade and industry, especially since the slave trade had been abolished and there is need for them to sustain their accumulative tendency in West Africa. So Leopold formed a private company called the International Congo Association, through which trading agreements with some 500 Congolese were signed. So it was this agreement signed with the Congolese by King of Belgium, King Leopold of Belgium, that also heightened the tension. However, Leopold's unprecedented interest in the Congo aroused the interest of other European countries. Most of them felt disenfranchised that how could a single country sign over 500 treaties just in the Congo alone, and that if care was not taken, it would probably lead to disenfranchisement of other European countries. The French and the Portuguese also started asserting themselves in the Congo as a result of attempt by King Leopold. Agents of these powerful nations went into the interior, therefore, to sign treaties with chiefs in various parts of West Africa, compelling them to sign agreements which would make them to surrender their land, their people, and their sovereignty to the Europeans. The French explorer de Brazza, for instance, claimed an area in the Congo which was as big as France itself, for you to know the extent of this European jostling for land. The Portuguese also wanted to have a trans-African empire by joining Angola on the west and Mozambique on the coast. They also exercise their own influence in that area. And to clear the confusion of claims and counterclaims on African territories, a conference was summoned under the chairmanship of Otto von Bismarck at Berlin in 1884, where the terms of partitioning and division of Africa was agreed. It was at Berlin conference that 15 countries agreed to share this partition. So 15 countries were represented by their various diplomats at the Berlin conference, and several revolutions were passed during the Berlin conference. So the terms of occupation of African land were discussed, in which no country was allowed to take more than it could effectively occupy. So it was supposedly going to be an inclusive and a very, very equitable distribution of African territories and land and patrimony among the Africans, among the Europeans. The European countries were allowed to take charge or retain areas they had occupied. This is another major attribute of the Berlin Conference. They were allowed to take charge or retain areas they had occupied by the terms of the treaty they had signed with African chiefs. These were to become the properties of European powers, regardless of language, race, custom, religion, ethnicity, or creed. It doesn't matter to the Europeans. So this explains why some part of Yoruba people are also can be found in French-speaking areas in Benin Republic, in Togo, for instance, and even in Ivory Coast. and it's also explained why some Nigerian people in south part of Nigeria can be found in Cameroon and so on, and even some northern some Hausa people and Kanuri people can be found as far as Lake Chad and Niger. So the aftermath of the Berlin Conference was the penetration of the hinterland of West Africa with aggressive signing with African chiefs and kings. The signing of treaties technically signaled the transfer of indigenous land and patrimony to these European powers, whether French, the British, the Germans, the Belgians, the Dutch, and what have you. Technological innovations, military might, and economic prosperity gave European powers the exuberance to subjugate, to control, to colonize these indigenous people in various parts of West Africa. After all, they had signed treaty with the chiefs, which gave them the legitimacy over their land. So the scramble was brief but hectic. By the end of the 19th century, all parts of West Africa except Liberia and Ethiopia had been subjugated and controlled by these European powers. But African leaders did not accept European incursion with absolute docility, because in the history of African resistance, it is incorrect to say that Africans gave up their sovereignty willingly without some form of resistance. So in the face of this European intrusion into their territories, some form of resistance were started. Africans did not accept European incursion with absolute docility. All right, so they put some effort. Of course, there are quite a lot of demonstrations here and there. In Lagos, for instance, there were resistance in Lagos. In 1890s, several kingdoms actually fought with looked the British in the face and fought. Such was the Jebu affairs in 1896, and Benin expedition also in 1898. In addition to several other resistance in different parts of West Africa. In March 1896, the European forces under the leadership of Emperor Melik II, for instance, surprised the world by defeating an Italian army sent to conquer the empire at the Battle of Adowa. Even though this was not a West African country, but it's a typical example of African resistance to this European takeover of their land and their resources. The Battle of Adowa was the climatic battle of the first Italo-European War, the first decisive combat between an African country and a European one, which led to the victory of an African country. The Ethiopian forces, who had high numerical superiority and weapons supplied by Russia and France, defeated Italian invading force on Sunday, 1st of March 1896 at the Battle of Adowa. So this actually signaled, it shows that some African countries, even though not in West Africa, were able to exercise their resistance against this European domination. The Berlin Conference, however, marked a watershed in the scramble and partition of Africa. The conference was called, as we have mentioned, by Otto von Bismarck to iron out major areas of conflict in the competition for land and territories in West Africa. The conference had its major agenda. Some of the major terms at the conference was the question of the Congo and Niger, and Niger, the free commerce in Africa was one of the cogent reasons why they dragged themselves, and the establishment of acceptable procedure in the acquisition of territories to avoid military confrontation and conflict among them, because before this period, several Europeans were represented by their trading companies. And as I've mentioned, because of this, the avalanche of European trading firms, the French trading companies, the Dutch, the British, the Portuguese, were all competing. And this actually brought about hostility and competition. And it was some of these issues they wanted to outline, such that there will be an acceptable procedure in the acquisition of territories to avoid military confrontation, so that one European country will not encroach to another person's territory, claiming rights and legitimacy. So ironically, Africans whose territories were being shared were not represented at the conference. This is one of the major hallmarks of this conference. The conference started in 1884 and ended in 1885 when the acts were signed by the major European powers, and this paved way for the newcomers to African scene. So compared to the 400 years of transatlantic slave trade, when the dehumanization, the brutality, the oppression, and the atrocities recorded in West Africa was so high. This marked another episode of devastating and catastrophic events in West Africa, as there was a reconfiguration of West African economy on the one hand. On the other hand, there was a penetration of the interior of West Africa by the Europeans. So the act required that claimants to the colonies notify other powers of the areas they had carved for themselves. So there were other revolutions at the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885. Some of these highlights include the recognition of King Leopold's claim over Congo. All right, in Congo, because I told you earlier on that King Leopold had already signed 500 treaties with the several communities in the Congo. So of course it was agreed that there must be a recognition of Leopold's claim over the Congo. There was also the free commerce in the Congo. It was agreed that free commerce, free market system should be open in the Congo. That every other power should be allowed to also explore. Of course, you need to understand the strategic location of Congo. Congo, especially, house one of the most, is the richest country on earth as we speak. It houses several mineral resources, and this explains the competition among the various European powers. Also, there was also the unbridled navigational rights, which were to be enforced by international commission because of the dominance of Britain. If you have read the work of Alfred Mackinder, who wrote that the British by the 19th century had become the global hegemon, who had control of the IC, the seaborne movement, and because of that, there was need to check the limit of Britain and the influence of Britain over the Atlantic movement. Consequently, the acquisition of different areas in West Africa by the European powers led, among other things, to a protracted and exploitative colonization of the region. To be sure, by the terms of the Berlin Conference, several European powers proceeded to the areas that had been cached for them to introduce or to institute colonial system. So this was a certificate of subordination received at the Berlin Conference, which gave them the legitimacy to proceed into those areas acquired at the Berlin Conference and institute colonial system. So colonialism was a form of imperialism in which a stronger power exercised its control over a weaker state through conquest, and this was the aftermath of the Berlin Conference. It was also true, of course, the signing of treaty, protection, and which include protection of the weaker state by the powerful state. According to the Scottish historian Neil Ferguson, colonialism connotes the imposition of power on foreign people over a relatively protracted time frame. So this shows that the Berlin Conference gave the European power the right to impose power on foreign people over a relatively time frame. So this explains the reason why in some part of West Africa, this colonial enterprise, for instance in Lagos, spanned over a century, about 100 years, starting from 1851 and ended in 1960. In other parts of Nigeria, colonialism started on the 1st of January 1900 and ended in 1960. And ditto for Gold Coast, the Gambia, and Sierra Leone, and what have you. So colonialism is also the subjection of the inhabitants of a weaker state to an alien rule, and which was the case in the 19th century when the Europeans used their Gatling and Maxim gun, backed by the treaty signed to. So the subjection of the inhabitant of a weaker state to an alien rule is one of the major features of colonial rule in West Africa. The control of this alien rule involves the domination of administrative, economic, social, political institutions in West Africa, and also the subjection of these people's life and customs, to the whims and caprices of European domination and policies. Colonialism, therefore, is a direct, total political control of the area. It is particularly a fundamental infringement on the rights of indigenous Africans whose resources, whose patrimony, land, and dignity no, were actually eroded by the Europeans. Across the West African region, colonialism involved the creation of institutions and structures for the administration of the subject people, including the appointment of governor general, regional governors, provincial residents, and other officials of state to run the affairs of the areas conquered. This actually meant that there was a total relegation of indigenous culture and institutions. The traditional political institutions, were destroyed by the virtue of colonial, imposition of certificate of subordination. The obas in most cases were removed. Most of them were banished from the throne, as was the case in Benin, as was the case in Ijebu, as was the case also in Katangora, and different parts of West Africa. Colonial capitalism in West Africa was generally characterized by exploitation of the natural resources of the colonial state for the benefit of the metropolitan state. It was a period that led to the peripheralization and the ruralization of West African economy, either in terms of the exploitation of mineral resources, abuse of human rights, and other atrocities committed by the European in West Africa. In West Africa, the British, for instance, adopted the British and the French, who probably had a larger share of West African territories, adopted different political systems of administration. It must be said that while the British in different parts of its colonies in West Africa adopted the indirect rule system, the French adopted initially the system of assimilation and later was upgraded to the system of association, where an average citizen was relatively treated as a semi-French citizen, while in the British colonies a system of indirect rule was used where indigenous authorities were relegated, and in most cases the British appointed people who had no direct connection to political authority for effective administration of colonial activities in West Africa. And this was also to aid the exploitation of raw materials, agricultural raw materials and commodities such as palm oil, palm kernel, rubber, cotton, coffee, cocoa, and other commodities. So through the promulgation of mineral ordinances, the colonial authorities were able to exploit the colonial state effectively, either in terms of agricultural, in terms of taxation, and also further the integration of the economy of West Africa into the vortex of global capitalism was entrenched as a result of the colonization, through which was achieved through the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885. Other features of colonial policies in West Africa include excessive taxation, the payment of low prices for primary products such as cocoa, the rubber, the granite they were extracting from West Africa, and this also led to the ruralization, as I've mentioned. So colonialism was exploitative of the people, the environment, the culture, the politics, and the institutions in West Africa, and it denigrated indigenous customs in West Africa, among other things. It also led to the underdevelopment, what some Marxist scholars have termed the dependency, the creation of unequal relationship between the center and the periphery. The metropolitan countries, Europe, were the center, while these dependent colonies were the periphery, and this continues to shape the economic and existential realities in West Africa even in the 21st century. Today, the sub-region remains the largest single world's liability as a result of the legacy of colonialism, the ruthless exploitation of mineral resources, the bastardization of African indigenous culture, institutions and customs, and the dehumanization of Africa, the robbery of people of their dignity. And these are some of the legacies of colonial capitalism, which was brought to bear by the Scramble and Partition of West Africa. So fundamentally, the Scramble and Partition led to the division of West Africa among various European countries. This explains why some parts of West Africa are controlled by the French. These are the areas known as the Francophone countries. These are areas like Togo, Benin, Ivory Coast, Chad, Niger, Sudan, and others, while some areas were controlled by the British, such as Nigeria, Gambia, Sierra Leone, and what of you? Some areas also were ceded to other European countries, such as the Germans. In some part of Cameroon also, of course, was initially between the French and the Germans. So in this class, we have technically discussed in brief the European scramble and partition for West Africa. Do not forget to like, to share, and to subscribe to this video. Thank you.